A real crime. In a series of podcasts, I want you to travel down some lonely roads with me. These are the roads I traveled with families who never got to say goodbye to loved ones. These family members were fated to live the rest of their lives waiting and wondering. I wrote these stories when I worked as a reporter for the Charleston Gazette. I appreciate you joining me today for part 2 in this podcast about the Reverend Michael Flippo. As I explained in part 1, there are many facets to his life. Today I will be exploring the history of fires and embezzlement, as well as his trial for murdering his wife. Episode 13, Part 2, Reverend Flippo. The fundraisers. In 1976, Rick McFadden was a 14-year-old dialysis patient who needed a kidney transplant. He was one of 13 children in his family living in a small Virginia town. His older sister attended the church Flippo pastored in nearby Bluefield, West Virginia. When Flippo and another church member learned that McFadden needed a transplant, they agreed to help raise money. McFadden remembers seeing donation boxes placed everywhere. He also said he knows people wrote checks for the donation. At one point, the bank account had a healthy balance of $8,000. Then my father went to check on it, and there was 24 cents in the account, McFadden recalled. His family never confronted Flippo or the other church member. When I became an adult, I said someone needs to confront him, McFadden said. Years later, the pattern repeated. If Christy Schumann's grandmother sat down, her hands picked up needles, yarn, felt, anything she could fashion into a small craft item to sell. If she stood up, she baked something to sell. She was worried sick about her granddaughter, who needed a liver and pancreas transplant. If she could bake a pan of brownies or knit a Christmas ornament, she would, to raise money for the procedure. In 1995, the family faced the crisis of their granddaughter's health. The family patriarch was an active member of the Landmark Church of God in Nitro. He helped to build the new church after the previous one was destroyed by fire. The former Main Street Church got a new name after it burned. Everyone rallied around this family. Local beauticians had fundraisers in their salons. Donations poured in. On November 1, 1995, the child's father, Raymond Schumann, met with Flippo and signed papers to set up the Christy Schumann Fund. Flippo signed the document that was typed in an elaborate script. Schumann, who still has a copy, thought it looked official. While Schumann left the church, thinking he'd done the right thing for his daughter, Flippo left the church and opened an account in his name only. At the time, Schumann and no one else in the church knew that only Flippo's name was on the account. When he was combing through cabin 13, Detective Burke found several pieces of paper in Flippo's pants. One note said that Flippo called Raymond Schumann April the 28th, 1996. The note states it was an interest-bearing account. Keep interest for use. As soon as word of Mrs. Flippo's murder circulated, Schumann called the bank. That was the first time he learned that his name was not on the account. When church officials started looking at the finances for Landmark Church, members wrote, "We discussed the problems with the Schumann Fund and listed the checks that were written to withdraw money. We are very concerned about the situation." The report also asked this question: what was done with the money? As he played spin the dial with church funds, Flippo could have written checks from the Schumann Fund to pay for his other bills. For example, the church committee wrote that the housing fund for Flippo was badly overwritten. Mike Flippo's parents made a $10,000 deposit into it specifically for their son, which was consequently eaten up by his bad checks. The fires. On November 21st, 1988, Ernie Hedrick was on the fire truck with other members of the Nitro Fire Department as they rushed to put out a fire at the Main Avenue Church of God. Hedrick recalled that he saw heavy black smoke coming from out of all four sides of the church when they arrived. It had an awfully good start for that time in the morning, he remembered. The fire department got the call at about 8 a.m. In what now appears like a ghostly presence, a newspaper reporter quoted Cheryl Flippo in an article written days after the fire. The reporter quoted Mrs. Flippo as saying her husband was in the church about 30 minutes before the fire broke out. In that same article, the Reverend Flippo listed the items he always wanted to have in a new church, like a larger foyer, accessible restrooms, a sanctuary on the main floor, a stage in the fellowship hall, and a bell. He told the reporter the building was insured for $240,000. He also pointed out to the reporter that they had already set up a rebuilding fund with a Nitro bank. Quick-acting Flippo managed to save a large walnut desk. He was speaking to the reporter from behind the massive desk, the reporter wrote. Flippo had already gotten the desk, a matching filing cabinet, a computer table, bookshelves, and a coat rack into a small apartment he rented while he waited for his faithful followers to raise enough money to build his new church. All of those items were in his church office. My office was the only room that was not really consumed by fire, he told the reporter. Every other room of the church was too badly damaged for anything to be salvaged. As he explained to the reporter, he'd never had much of an office in any of his other churches. So, 2 years before the fire, church members built an addition to the main Avenue church for his office. He furnished it as he wanted. Luckily, fire spared his choice items. When interviewed after Flippo was convicted for murder, Fireman Hedrick said he was astonished to learn of all the fires in Flippo's history. He said he and other members of the Nitro Fire Department had their suspicions about the church fire they were called on to fight, but he said arson is difficult to prove. In 1978, in Bluefield, West Virginia, Gina Jewell lived with her sister and her family while she went to college. She and Cheryl just managed to rescue the 3 small boys and escape themselves. Gina said Reverend Flippo was the last to leave the smoke-filled house. Safely in the car, the 6 of them drove away. But Gina looked back. Them flames just shot out of every window. It just exploded. A few years before that, Gina recalled that Reverend Flippo had a church in Matewan, West Virginia. The fire started in the living room of the parsonage. The living room wall abutted the wall to their oldest child's bedroom. This house, too, burned to the ground. Add Flippo's parents' mobile home to the list. It, too, burned, and a car Cheryl was driving caught fire. Another of Cheryl's sisters, Anita Jewell Pratt, remembered that Flippo told the family he wanted to build a bigger church. He showed us the lot where he wanted to build. Then after the church burned, they built a bigger church on the lot he wanted. The motive. Inside Cabin 13, Deputy Burke found letters that Cheryl and Mike wrote to each other. The letters indicate the two were feeling a strain that Cheryl believed was harmful to them as a family. The strain came from Flippo's friendship with Joel Boggess. Boggess worked at a company whose property bordered Flippo's church. In the letters, Reverend Flippo called Boggess a friend, and he was irritated with his wife. "Why can't I have a friend?" he wrote. Besides his desire to save his friendship, Flippo chafed at his wife trying to control his finances. They were ordered $80,000 from a car accident, and she insisted the money be saved in an account that would require 2 signatures. She knew he would spend the entire amount on anything that caught his fancy. Reverend Flippo was prayer partners with Tamara Lynn Cremines, a member of his church and a friend to both Flippo and his wife. 6 days before Cheryl was murdered, Reverend Flippo asked Cremines to pray for Cheryl because she disliked the relationship he had with Boggess. He also asked his prayer partner that he wanted to buy land with Boggess, and he asked her to get God's guidance. Would God think it was a good idea to get a loan and buy land with Boggess? Flippo and Boggess wanted to buy a 12-acre tract with the idea that they would divide it and sell parts of it. In March, Flippo took out a life insurance policy for his wife that was set to become effective on April Fool's Day, 1996. The The policy insured her for $100,000 and made him the beneficiary. Flippo wrote the $313 check to the insurance company from the Landmark Church account. Flippo apparently chafed at this life and the constraints his wife put on his spending. Flippo's frustrations powered the blows he landed on his wife's head. As she put her hands up to block the blows, he broke her fingers as he hit away at her. The search warrant and indictment. Before a Fayette County magistrate, May 3rd, 1996, Detective Steve Kessler wrote that Flippo's story was without credibility. Kessler asked for a search warrant that included blood samples and fingerprints from Flippo. After the magistrate granted the warrant, police took Flippo to the state medical examiner's office, where he was fingerprinted and blood drawn. In September of the same year, Kessler's name, along with Joel Bogus's name, would appear on the murder indictment against Flippo for his wife's murder. According to the indictment, both Kessler and Flippo and Bogus testified before the grand jury. The trial. The idea that a pastor seemed to have played a lead role in a bad TV movie, Cabin 13, please, captivated audiences. When the trial got underway at the Fayette County Courthouse, television satellite trucks from near and far covered the parking lot. Inside, every seat was taken in the large courtroom. Cheryl's family occupied the front 2 rows. Several men with perfectly styled hair attended daily. They were also pastors and members of the Church of God hierarchy. Members of the press had to arrive early. If they got up, they lost their seats. Many people who did not write for a living also took notes throughout the trial, including a Church of God pastor's wife. Before the trial, Fayette County Circuit Judge John Hatcher agreed the case could be bifurcated. That means divided into 2 parts. After the guilty verdict came in, jurors returned the next day to hear the tales of Flippo's embezzlement. The judge believed the jurors should not hear this evidence during the murder trial. In the first part of his trial, Flippo was found guilty of murdering his wife. When the jury reconvened for the second part, October the 23rd, 1997, they did not recommend mercy after hearing how Flippo stole money from his church and people in need. Flippo hired lawyer David Schless, who doggedly attacked each piece of evidence the prosecution put forth. He especially grilled Detective Burke. A member of the West Virginia State Police Forensic Lab testified that he found a clear right index fingerprint inside the roll of duct tape Burke found in the bathroom at the cabin. The print was Flippo's. As the trial progressed, courthouse regulars wondered if Flippo would take the stand. Of course, no person ever has to testify in his own defense. But one lawyer wondered, Flippo must have a pleasing voice for delivering sermons, and he must be persuasive. When the prosecution rested, Schless called only Flippo's sons as character witnesses. Schless tried to discredit everything Detective Burke did, but after the jury found Flippo guilty, Burke slipped handcuffs on Flippo. As part of the explanation of embezzlement, Raymond Schumann of Charleston testified that hundreds of people tried to help his family raise money for his daughter's liver and pancreas operations. They donated $87,000 to the Christy Schumann Fund. From the start, Schumann believed that 2 signatures were required before any money could be withdrawn from his daughter's fund. But after Cheryl Flippo was murdered, Schumann discovered that only Flippo's signature was on the account. Flippo took almost $16,000 from the account meant to help the child. When Flippo's family learned that the money was missing from the child's account, they put the money back. Schumann's daughter was able to have her surgeries, and her father told the jurors she was doing fair at the time he testified. Flippo's lawyer did not dispute that Flippo took the money. After the trial, one faithful member of Flippo's congregation sent the presiding judge a 17-page, single-spaced letter complaining of the lack of defense. The writer expressed his belief that the case was not properly investigated and that Flippo's defense was not properly presented at trial. The writer, a member of Flippo's congregation, wrote of Flippo that he had probably cried out all the tears available in his tear ducts. The writer also told the judge that the real murderer was still on the loose. The writer admitted that he too was disturbed by the money stolen from the child's transplant fund, but the writer explained the funds Pastor Flippo removed were primarily used for the needs of the church and others. In the writer's opinion, Schlesch offered no defense, but most defense lawyers would agree that Schlesch did the best with what he had. If Flippo had taken the stand, he would open himself to questions from the prosecution. Appeals. Some members of Flippo's congregation and his mother never lost faith in him. Flippo appealed the circuit court decision both to the Supreme Court of West Virginia and all the way to the United States Supreme Court to no avail. Lawyers for Flippo argued that police should never have opened the briefcase or looked at the pictures inside. Fayette County Circuit Judge John Hatcher wrote that a nearly hysterical Flippo called for help, and police came to the cabin. Police considered all of Cabin 13 a crime scene, including the briefcase that sat on a table a few feet away from the victim's body. After outlining all the evidence, Hatcher also wrote that if some nameless attacker was brutalizing Flippo's wife, as the medical examiner described, surely this attack would generate enough commotion and screams for help to awaken Flippo, who said a blow to his head knocked him out. But Flippo told police he remained unconscious during the horrific attack. In a 2001 order, Hatcher denied Flippo's request for a new trial. In prison. After he went to prison, Flippo published a book of poems entitled A Collection from Creation, Observations from Nature, viewed from the small window of his cell at Mount Olive Correctional Complex, Mount Olive, West Virginia. He dedicated the 112-page book to his mother Betty. The back of the book includes a nice picture of Flippo, wearing a jacket and a white tie. The poem he entitled Frost explained that he liked nothing better than licking the spoon and the bowl from a chocolate cake that his grandmother made. He also noted that his wife would save the frosting bowl for him, but she infrequently made homemade icing for her birthday in our house. From prison in 2017, Flippo also wrote a letter to the editor that ran in the Charleston Gazette. "What is wrong with our country?" the letter began. "Men are paid millions of dollars to play NFL football, and still they can't show any allegiance to the American flag. I say send them to Iran or North Korea and let them play ball there. I will cease to watch NFL if this disgraceful, racist action continues." Signed, Michael Flippo, Mount Olive. I have seen no reports of athletes in expensive footwear quaking after Flippo's letter ran. Flippo, who turned 74 on January 31, is serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Thanks again for listening, and many thanks to Tommy Siner for the recording. Please listen next week for a new episode of A Real Crime by Susan Williams.